So now we're looking at the subject of the dream structure. And if I can just remind you before I give you my example of it, we have the nucleus of the dream. We have the fact that emotional, astral energy will circulate around it and create an attractive force which will cause constellating of elements into the dream. And I'm going to illustrate that right now. It's in reference to a dream had by the Duke of Hamilton one night. It was the night before Hesse arrived in England. So it can be dated, and the politics of the time can be looked at. And the dream said that Hitler was going to land in Scotland near his place, and the whole dream was centered around a peace overture. In other words, it was wartime and Britain was in trouble, and the general feeling was that maybe it was the time to talk peace. So there's no argument about the fact that it was a dream with a meaning that was quite clear, and it began to assemble emotional energy around it. The link of the dream is with what we call the unconscious, and it's a collective unconscious, which means that the dream was sponsored, or as it were propagated by United Kingdom, was part of the unconscious. Germany, which was at war with Britain, was part of the unconscious. And you would have the USA and France, defeated France, and so on. So this was the collective unconscious of mankind, and a sprouting of it, a focal point of energy, produced this dream in the mind of the Duke of Hamilton. The result of this was that elements of the dream began to flow in, because the emotion, the affect, was constellating. It was drawing elements towards it, and we could put one of them as being the Nazi swastika, symbolizing Germany. There was Hitler himself was coming in the dream, and Chamberlain, who was the, if you like, you could have the brolly, which was the symbol of peace with Chamberlain. There was an airplane involved, and Hesse, Hitler's friend, was involved, and that just about puts us all in the picture. And there was a threat of war, but the theme of the dream was a peace overture. The following day, Hesse, not Hitler, but Hesse, Hitler's right-hand man, landed solo. He didn't land, he arrived over Scotland in a plane that he had taken off from Germany in, and jumped out of the plane with a parachute and came down, and he was brought into the Duke of Hamilton's presence. And so this was a dream which had implications on a wide scale. It was first of all, the nucleus was peace. For heaven's sake, let's try and resolve this war, and it was a peace overture. the constellating features of peace, wanting peace, the emotional energy coming from the astral world, centered on the meaning of the dream, and immediately attracted various elements that fitted in with this is how a dream is built. There is the basic nucleus, and as it attracts, constellating force attracts, elements go to make the dream up. There was Hitler involved, there was Hess, there was the plane, there was the symbol of Germany, Nazism, the symbol of Chamberlain's peace. It was all there, and that was the dream that the Duke of Hamilton had. Now that is something that you should put in your spiritual diaries, because if you can understand that, you can begin to break any dream that you have down, have had, and put it down in the diary, and you should therefore search for certain things. And the first is, what is the overall meaning of the dream? What is the dream's nucleus? Then you ask, well, how was this theme, motif, presented in the dream? What were the elements? These are elements, dream elements, that made the dream up. And what was the effectiveness on you? Things that you should also note are, did the dream evoke wonder? To make a note of these things. Wonder. Was it foreboding, menacing? Was it a dream of joy? Was there mystery about it? Was there confusion? And so you should note down the affect that the dream produced in you. And that would be a heading, would suggest the anatomy of dreams, the anatomy of dreams. The connection with the unconscious is a good one here, because it shows that the consciousness of the planet is shared. It's shared by nations in different ways. Their symbols, their opinions, their attitudes are all different, but blending together in what we call the collective unconscious. Jung said a dream was a symbolic meaning reflected out of the unconscious and could only be interpreted or understood by a special technique of interpretation. So that's part of a method of interpreting a dream. In other words, if somebody says, I had a dream and you're my psychologist and I want you please to tell me, what does this dream mean in my life? You must be able to break it down like that and analyze the affect in it, the emotional expression in it. And if you can do that, then people coming to you about dreams will be very happy, satisfied with it. So make a note and say the dream of the Duke of Hamilton on the subject or the nucleus of a peace overture. And obviously Hamilton did not know enough about Hess in his externa for Hess to be in the dream. And so the next one, like Hess, would have been Hitler, who everyone knew. And so selecting from his vocabulary of images, this is what came up. In the same way, and I'm going to suggest here that these are a group of predictive dreams. They're predicting. Hitler's coming, all right? If it's not Hitler, it's Hitler's emissary. What will be the subject of Hitler's visit? It will be a peace overture, and so on. My sister Margaret is quite psychic, and she has had experiences related to predictive dreams. I was severely wounded in Italy and was carried out of a Sherman tank and put on a dingo. A dingo was an armored car, and transported from the site of the ambush back to Orvieto, which was about 25 miles away. And it was, for me, partly a nightmare journey with pain and so on, but it was also good for me in the sense that the fresh air, lying on top of the dingo, the fresh air beating into my open mouth, and I was even breathing through the hole in my chest. It was a very refreshing thing for me, and so on. Back in South Africa at that time, my sister had a dream, a very vivid dream, in which I was straddled across a horse, and the horse was staggering back, and there was blood all over the place, and she awoke with this menacing feeling that I, her brother, had been hurt. And it was a true dream. And so you can get predictive dreams of such a nature. There's no doubt about it, you know, that the seriousness of a situation will help to generate dreams. Another thing that generates dreams and visions is grief, where there has been the loss of somebody has died. The best example we've got as English people is Diana's death. The terrible grief that took the nation over. Where there is grief, they say misery accumulates, and I would add to that the fact that it tends to attract ectoplasm. Ectoplasm is a material, an amorphous material, which flows out of all of us to different extent. Probably we couldn't at the best produce more than a few ounces of ectoplasm. But in materializing mediums, ectoplasm in vast amounts can pour from the orifices of the body, also from under the arms and the umbilicus, the ears, nose, and so on. And when there's enough ectoplasm gathered around the medium, it is possible for astral forms to be able to partly materialize themselves in this heavy atmosphere of grief. And of course, this will have significance in the future. There was a medium in London, not so long ago, who used to be able to, where there was a bereavement, she used to be able to, she was an artist, she would be able to draw the dead person's face, features, in a room, in a house, where the widow was grieving bitterly, generating an atmos in which ectoplasm, there was sufficient ectoplasm for the psychic person, an artist, to see who was near her, with her, and to draw a picture of the dead person. I've forgotten the name of it, but she's very well known in spiritualist circles. Dreams can sometimes bring extraordinary wisdom and knowledge. Nobody denies that who has investigated dreams in the psychological world. They all admit that extraordinary wisdom can be bestowed in a dream. The high peak experience of Priestley on God's Hill, as he saw the whole process of life flowing through the flocks of birds there, following, this is important, where there has been something left over from the last 2 days. The elements of the dream that we have been talking about, these are the elements of the dream that are attracted to it. The elements are often taken from experiences you've had in the last day or two, especially if they are vivid, especially if they are incidental, which means they can be easily attracted, picked up. You all know, if you're English, what was meant by the remains of the day. In the old days, Victorian days, the staff, the domestic staff, would serve the meals, and after dinner at night they would gather in the kitchen and eat the remains of the day, whatever had been left over from the meals that had been served. They would get stuck in, doesn't matter how much, or that was what they called it, the remains of the day. Well, dreams tend to be fashioned, the elements of a dream tend to be fashioned out of the remains of the visual images of the day. And I want to relate a dream that was had by a person who came to dinner. I think Joe was there, and I think Sorrel was there. This person had had some unhappiness in his life fairly recently, and somewhat of a materialist. He was an accountant, and he had come to dinner, and he said, I want to tell you about a dream I've had. It's the most extraordinary thing that's ever happened psychically in my life, because I'm not a psychic person. And he recounted his dream. He said that he had a dream out of nowhere for no particular reason at all. It just came to him, in which he was shown a gizmo. And by a gizmo we mean a device, a strange sort of technical device. And the device was that a person ringing a front doorbell could have his picture taken by a device on the front door, and wherever you, the owner of the house, were in the house, wherever you were, you would get a noise of the bell going. You would take out your hand device and press it, and you would be able to see, wherever you were in the house, see who was at the front door. And he described other technical things about it, although he wasn't a technical man himself. And he said he had received this, and he was on his way to see somebody more technically equipped than himself in order to take out a patent on it. Is that more or less as you remember it, Joe? Yes. His name was Dennis Hunter. And if ever you want me to bring him along here to recount the dream, I'd be happy to do so. But that was extraordinary, because he wasn't even technically equipped to deal with such an electrical device. Then we do have dreams of previous lives. We do have dreams of previous lives. And if you keep a spiritual diary, you tend to be able to recognize when it is a dream of a previous life. I had a life in Sweden once, and quite uncharacteristically for anything I had experienced in this life, the dream concerned houses that were built with wood, very much like those doors that you see at the back of the room there. But the whole house was built of this kind of wood, And it's that sort of thing that helps to tell you, now, that's not me. I haven't seen houses like that in this life, built of solid wood. And in fact, quite often, knowledge of a previous life comes to us through a dream. One of the girls in our group had was walking through through one of the art galleries in London, and she was confronted by a Van Gogh picture, and the Van Gogh picture showed an outside restaurant with a colourful blind over the tables on the boulevard. And just above the restaurant, in the bright sky, there was a brilliant planet showing itself, which she understood to be Venus. And she went home and that night had a very forceful dream in which Van Gogh, she had had a life during the French, what do they call themselves? The type of painting.
Impressionists?
Impressionists, yes. The Impressionists had the main emotional tone was Impressionism. And that's what you have to look for. That's why this picture is so valuable, this drawing, that you look for a central theme or motif, you look for the emotional tone or affect, and in her case it was Impressionism, because everything was color. There was nothing in black and white and line drawing or anything. It was all in Impressionist color. And from this dream experience, she had an impression, she described it, an impression that she had been associated with a group of artists of whom Van Gogh was one. And you do definitely get, but of course it depends how many years you have undergone spiritual disciplines, how you have, or whether you have purified your nature. If you're smoking like a trooper and goodness knows what, you must expect to have distortions, tremendous distortions of dreams if you are smoking, if you are, well, naughty spiritually. Shall I just leave it like that? So then I gave you Priestley's Dream of Birds on God's Hill. Then I wanted to talk about how the nature of dreams like this one, where you have got peace overture, if the peace had succeeded, and I've made a very careful study of World War II, and there's no doubt in my mind today that the threat to invade Britain was a feint. That what Hitler wanted to do was not to strike at Britain, but to create a feint in that direction so that he could attack Russia, which was his main target. And it explains many of the strategies of World War II. The point I'm making here is that dreams can often be epic in nature. They can reflect epic stories, epic circumstances, as if you were having a dream of the Titanic or something, and there were thousands in the water, or another epic theme some 30 or 40 years ago was a dream of flying saucers or UFOs. And it didn't mean that they were really UFOs. They meant new thought, new dimensions, high ideas. And especially if you met somebody who was an astronaut, suggesting to you that a person very advanced in thinking was going to visit you. So what I'm trying to do now is to introduce the idea that your vocabulary may change according to what externa you've got in you. If you are a person who has not much experience in life at all, then dreams will be very, very hard to transmit a message to you. But the epic nature that dreams can take can be cultivated. As some of you know, here, who are my students, as some of you know, it was possible to present a giant project to the unconscious. Alice Bailey, anybody know Alice Bailey's work? Alice Bailey produced a huge output of esoteric literature, esoteric healing, esoteric psychology, cosmic fire, and so on and so on. And Professor Carl Jung was asked, how is it possible that this frail housewife could sit down wherever she was, even sometimes on a compartment in a train, or in her bedroom, or at dinner or something, sit down and pass this huge volume of material through her merely by writing it down on note paper and tossing the sheets from her, which were collected by a scribe who typed them and put them in order and so on, and turned out this marvelous set of theosophy, the Alice Bailey teachings. And Jung said it had to be a stream from the unconscious, that the unconscious had got something built up in it. All right, I'm going to use a nasty simile now, like a festering sore, where you have got pus under the skin, and it builds up and builds up and builds up and then points, and the next moment out it comes. Well, it was sort of like that something built up in the unconscious, and it was this tremendous set of theosophical truths which came bursting out through her, assisted by a master of the wisdom. Now, I knew nothing about astrology 50 years ago, and I had to learn everything. First of all, from aging astrologers around me in Cape Town, and then by sheer blood, sweat, and tears practicing astrology. And slowly I became equipped in the background to the subject and began to interpret charts. Then I had this overwhelming, I suppose I must call it a command from a being higher than man, that I should attempt an astrology dictionary. And it was as good as saying to me, good heavens, you may as well be told to write a philosophical treatise in Chinese as to do that in astrology. But I got the group interested in it, and we set about it, and about 7 of us, together, taking 7 years, and that wasn't by calculation, it just happened that way, we were able to present a stream of aspects. A stream of aspects, that's a planet in a sign, in a house, with the sign on the cusp of the house. 4 factors in an unending presentation in a book which would be the equivalent today of a spiritual diary, and say to this being, perhaps, to a group of higher beings, they said that they had contact with both China and ancient Egypt, and to present these astrological glyphs in their particular complex aspects, one by one, on a clean page in a manuscript book. What does this mean? What is this aspect? And back through the rest of the night or the day, didn't matter whether you were awake, but mainly when you were dreaming, especially when you were coming out of a dream, which we call hypnopompia. When you're coming out of a dream, the answers came. A stream of interpretations of that aspect, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And eventually, something like 100,000 aspects were translated into good colloquial English. And it occupied me totally for a long period of time, in between lectures, of course. And out of it came the astrological dictionary. We may have a copy here, I don't know, but you'll certainly see it next time. And the point I'm making is that if you are careful, if you equip yourself in the necessary elements of how to accept a dream clearly and unequivocally, you can take on epic tasks. I mean, you think of any other task you like, and it will never be bigger than that of taking down a dictionary that ran to 1,500 pages of close in astrological glyph and language and symbols. And so that's something about the scope of using dreams. It is as if a dream rises to a challenge in your personality life. If you're desperate and you want to know something, you must be able to record your waking dreams. There is a technique whereby you can posit a question in your spiritual diary on a clean page and present it to your, let's call it the unconscious, and go off to sleep. And be prepared to remember, take down the waking dream when you wake up in hypnopompia. You can refine this to such an extent that the whole dream life can be articulate. It can give you answers to questions. Now, the questions are not going to be in perfect English. They're not even going to be always, or they're rarely going to be in words, but they will be mainly in visual images. And the visual images may be brought together to form a symbol. And the symbols may be constellated together to give a story, a narrative, a description, perhaps of the contents of an ancient temple or a previous life or something of that nature. Never ever say to yourself, it's impossible for this communication by dream to have occurred in that way by dreaming. The whole method of dreaming is related to our civilizations, which occurred in the astral world of the past. Nothing could be further from the truth than to see the young kids of today, often very blonde with blue eyes, tall and slender, and to say that these emerged, arose, evolved out of gorillas and apes. I won't have it. I won't have it from any scientists who talk such nonsense. And you know they do it deliberately. If you go into the museums, you will see this evolution nonsense. I'm not a fundamentalist. I have no particular religion. But I will not have it that the gorgeous potential of humanity is linked to anthropoid life. We had our civilizations in the astral part of the moon and the astral part of the earth. And those civilizations taught us many things. Several times humanity nearly died out on the surface of the planet, was reduced to 10,000 globally. And the strange laws of nature then begin to operate. The lower the population numbers, the more likely it is that there will be astral materializations in physical bodies, especially in caves. And in the old days, of course, the earth was going through ice ages, and mankind was driven into the caves. They had nowhere else to go in the northern hemisphere. And it was in the caves where there was darkness and there was warmth that mankind, in many instances, just a clan or a family survived. And it was then that strange and terrible things happened. Even when I go to Italy and talk for 4 days in seminars there are things I don't want to talk about. They can come to you through reading the Akashic records. You heard me deliberately a moment ago talking about teaching worms to crawl around the top of a wine glass, then cutting them in half, and they growing themselves again, and then taking their DNA and putting it into another worm, and the worm that's had part of the other's DNA planted into it is able to do it without any training. Marvelous things can happen. One of the terrible things arising or relating to that story of the 2 worms that I've just mentioned was the fact that cannibalism was rife in the early days of mankind's struggle on the planet. The male members of humanity, as science confirms, most often did not live beyond 18 years of age. That was the average age of men on the planet in those early days. And so starvation was rife, and especially aggravated by the Ice Age. And it was in these circumstances that hunting had to be done, of course, and animal forms were dragged back to the caves and eaten. But quite often food ran out completely, and it was then that bones were cracked and the marrow eaten, and even human had to eat human to survive. And I say that for only one reason, and that's to understand that even in that act of cannibalism, knowledge of the one eaten was passed on to those who were eating in the way that I described earlier, scientific fact, proof that the behavior of a creature can be passed on to the genes in the DNA of its those who inherit. And there are many stories of ancient times, and if you want to go into the science of dreams and you want to become perfected in the ability to read and, more than anything, to interpret what you have experienced in a dream, or to interpret dreams for others, you must change your life. You must be able to see these things. It is said that if a people doesn't remember their history, they will tend to die young. And it was a terrible situation on the earth that there was no chance for most of the human population to know anything about its history. Terrible things occurred where women were deprived of men entirely, and they had their children, and the children and the women very frequently died in childbirth because of infection. And babies were without mothers. And we've often wondered why it was that the male human still retains the two breasts. And it was as a result of these terrible situations where the men had to look after babies that it changed their very huntsman-like macho outlooks into very feminine states. And they would take these babies, and the male breasts would undergo what we call gynecomastia, and breasts would develop, and the babies were able to suckle at male breasts. That sort of extraordinary thing shows to what lengths the human form can adapt and change itself. I used to be amazed when I was a child and read about what life would be like on Jupiter, that Jupiter had such a tremendous gravity that they would have tendons that reached from the shoulder to the wrist so that they could pick things up on Jupiter against gravity. But of course this is not true of mankind. Mankind can exist on the planets either in a physical body or in an astral or a mental or even a spiritual structure and still have consciousness. And that is an indication of the adaptability of mankind. We live on a strange planet in which there are great contrasts in consciousness. 60 to 70% of the globe's population still to this day have never made a phone call. And you know what making phone calls, well, we should know today, shouldn't we, with the way kids are running around with phones. You make a phone call, you're immediately putting yourself in a position of seeing somebody at a distance that you're talking to. Isn't it true? And you are inquiring about others. You are extending your consciousness in an inobvious way when we put phone calls through. I'd be happy to answer questions now for the remainder of the time. I've said a lot of provoking things. What I want you to go home with is this format and the determination that you will from now on begin to record certainly the most significant of your dreams. You don't have to analyze them. You don't have to do anything to them except to get them down, if possible, in longhand. Longhand is not the same as recording them on a computer. The computer, at the moment, perhaps for the next 100 years, is not as valid as writing in longhand. It will become, no doubt, in strange ways, but at the moment, if you have anything important to record, my notes are all written in longhand. I don't touch a computer and never have. But that doesn't mean to say I don't have people around me with computers doing hard work on them. But if you want to develop certain innate qualities within you, and dream life extends back much, much longer than our planet does. Bye-bye, dear. Oh. Life in the astral world of the Earth went back 20 million years ago. And these factors like dreams are very old in us. And you can't hide them. You can't repress them. Questions? Yes, sir.
I do dream, but I go for long periods where I don't recall dreams. I'm sure I'm dreaming, but I'm not recalling them. I'm not in a...
You want to know why?
Why? And you mentioned esoteric steps you can take.
Some people come, not many people, don't dream at all. They don't dream at all. One of the reasons is that they have led lives in which they have dreamt a lot, and in which they have dreamt too much. And in this life, it is part of the soul's intention that they become less subjective and more objective. Doctors often do not dream. And I have several friends who are doctors and don't dream. And it seems to me that the cause of this is decision-making. If you are involved in a lot of decision-making in your daily work, or whatever it is you do, that the constant necessity to make decisions, as a doctor will if he has a clinic and people are coming in and he's asking them questions and making decisions and prescribing a particular treatment, that this is anathema to dream life. It means that whatever is within is being expressed. And I have the same experience after extensive lecturing. I get back to Little Elephant and I can't interiorize anymore for the time being, which means that I wouldn't be able to have a dream for the time being. What I do instead is to turn the telly on and be fed with images rather than searching for images inwardly to back what I'm teaching. And so the other thing that tends to stop dreaming, halt dreaming, has been in the past, less now though, and that is smoking late at night. Now that's all I can tell you about the factor of not dreaming. I wish I knew more about it. Do you know more than I do?
No, I've heard that eating cheese might promote dreams.
Yes, Joe.
Part of the question was esoteric disciplines to stimulate the dream life.
Well, first of all, you don't smoke. There's a great question about smoking. Is it right if the National Health says, we're not going to treat this person because he refuses to give up smoking, and we're not going to give him treatment for his chest condition? Who would agree that that is a right policy? Am I alone? Bad karma, isn't it? That you can ruin part of yourself and then go and get a replacement and go on doing it.
Can I just ask you something?
Sorry?
Going back to World War II,
Yeah.
World War I,
Yeah.
everybody smoked, didn't they? Most people. Now, I've done research, and people during that period of time did not have heart attacks, didn't have chest problems, and there wasn't many cancer problems about. Now, why is it today there's a massive increase?
Build up. The build up. like you sometimes find with some of the drugs that kids are taking, that the drug builds up and builds up and builds up, and even when they've given it up, they have flashbacks and goodness knows what, on and on and on and on. And I think that the human species, especially in the West, was affected by constant smoking, and cancer, if we are to believe Bailey, cancer was precipitated in Atlantis by constant emotional appeals, demands made upon the emotional nature. And you don't throw that off overnight. You don't throw it off in a generation. And the emotional factor is still with us. I mean, it's being now cultivated not by the temples of Atlantis, it's being cultivated by talk shows. What do you call them? What's her name?
Oprah Winfrey.
Oprah Winfrey show. Nothing wrong with the show, it's a step in the right direction. But where there is the assembly of a group of victims, and they pour out the terrible experiences that they've had, and the whole audience around them is joining in the experience and participating and doing them each perhaps a little bit of good, but that's going out on the air. And people by the hundreds of thousands are watching this emotional deluge. And the effect of it is that, and this is an occult fact, that every time you feel strongly with something you see strongly, that these two are wedded together, feeling and perception, and they pass out into the astral world and form the memory of mankind. And if you were to travel around in the inner worlds, you would find that the astral world is disappearing fast. Great gaps in the astral world are occurring, and it's because the population of the planet has risen to 6 billion, 3 times what it was when I was a child, and everybody is taking in emotion. The Oprah Winfrey shows they're taking in emotion. You may see 4 murders in one night. You may perceive half a dozen heroic athletes winning record races. It's emotion, it's emotion, it's emotion. And in order to express emotion, you've got to take the emotional energy in and act it out. And it's coming out of the astral world. It happened to a lesser extent with the industrial revolution. People who were used to generating thoughts of cathedral spires and angelic cherubims and organ playing and trumpets and goodness knows, that was all in the astral world under feeling. But when the Industrial Revolution started to come in, new things were created, the steam engine, and the young creative people in universities were modernizing and mechanizing, and so the energies that were embedded in the religious themes of Catholicism especially were sucked out into this new, and it's happening today, and that is that people are exposed to emotional stimulation, Hollywood if you like, exposed to emotional stimulation the whole time, and it's sucking hell out of the astral world. And that's not such a terrible thing. But what is difficult, I don't expect anyone to understand this, but what is difficult is that the mental world is almost empty and not yet populated, not yet structured, because very few people can think without feeling. If a person can't win an argument, a mental argument, they emotionalize it straight away. And the only way that the mental world can be constructed, and in a nice orderly way, is for, even if they are science fiction writers, if they can think without emotion, they can create structures in the mental world. Yes, young man?
That's fascinating, thank you. I was wondering about if dreams is kind of...
Did you say I was making you think?
You probably were.
Thank you very much. Now I'm pleased.
If dreams are kind of journeys into the astral zone, the out-of-body experience is kind of, is that journeying into the same realm? So is this kind of the similar kind of experience as astral travel in a dream, an out-of-body experience?
Well, astral travelling's a damn sight harder than it was 20 years ago when we had an astral world to move around in. And it's affecting what happens at death. Many people that would normally go into the astral reservoirs where they would be able to live happy life after death situations, the externalization of the astral body from the physical at death means that they don't go very far. They are finding, they're drawing emotional energies from around them, hundreds, thousands of people around us all the time. And when you die, you throw off the physical body and you draw astral matter and energy from those around you and fashion an astral body and live more or less in the circumstances that we exist in physical bodies. We must end.